Okay, so I told you there were 6 principles and 5 practices, and these are the 5 practices really are the things that that I live into. Now, what's interesting about these 5 practices is this is what, if you are like, we at the focus group, I have this vision that we would be able to say yes to every single person that God brings us, right? Like, I get kind of, my team at the focus group sort of gets angry at me because, like, if God brings us a missionally aligned client that is serving the Lord and loves Jesus, then I feel like we need to figure out a way to serve them. But there are some ministries that are raising hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and there is a missionary out there that needs to raise $50,000 a year, right? And I think we need to be equipped to serve all of them. Like, one of the other missionaries that my wife and I support, and we've taken through our training, is one of our friends who's on staff with the Jesus Film. Right? And it was long before I knew much about the Jesus Film. I just knew him. He grew up in our church. So when he asked me relationally for money, I said yes. And then I said, well, how's it going? He's like, I'm kind of stuck, right? And so I was able to say, well, I'll give you money, but I also will take you through our training that we do. And so these 5 things, we do them if you need to raise 50 grand or you need to raise 250 million. It is exactly what we do over and over again. If you want to come work with the focus group, just listen to the next hour and you'll be good, right? And so Vince and I are going to explain our framework, and Vince gets to start off by the first one, which is the fundraising case. Like, you've heard of it before, and you just push the advance button.
Oh, great. Hi, good to be with you. So I am going to do the framework. I will give you a really quick testimony since Brad gave you his testimony of working for Young Life. So how many of you got into vocational Christian ministry so you could raise money? That was your primary driver. You were like, Jesus gospel, that's kind of okay. My primary goal in life, that's him and Larry. Those are the only 2 that were that way. So I didn't, so surprisingly, I didn't either, right? So I graduated from college. My wife and I did not grow up in Christian homes. My wife actually grew up culturally Jewish. And heard the gospel in college, right, and gave her life to Jesus, Yeshua, right? And so she gave her life to Jesus. I did late in high school, and so I was headed to law school. She was going to be an international businesswoman. Our campus minister said, Vince, why don't you guys pray about what it would mean to really invest your life for Jesus a little bit differently? I ended up in collegiate ministry, right, on a college campus, sharing with student athletes about Jesus and the gospel, right? So that's what I ended up doing. So over the next 15 years, I was on campus. I had a variety of positions in college ministry. I ended up becoming the COO, which sounded really impressive. Just meant I had to do everything. And so that was my job, right? Yeah, we have some other recovering COOs out there. So the guy who was the president and CEO of the organization I was working for was retiring. And he went to the board. And he said, I'm retiring. My time's up. I think Vince should be my successor. So he goes to this executive committee of the board, right? Says this. And the executive committee of the board has this very fancy meeting with me, and they sit me down and they say, Vince, we think you should be the next president and CEO of this organization. And I said, well, I'm really honored, thank you. And they said, here's our main concern. We don't think you'll be very good at fundraising. And I said, I don't know that I'd be very good at I've raised my salary my whole life, my whole professional life, but I've never raised $5 million for an organization annually, which is what I would have to do. Maybe you're right. And they said, here's why we think you're going to be really bad at fundraising. You like people too much. I swear to you, that's what he said. The board chair said, you like people too much. And I said, I do like people a lot. This could be a problem, right? And they said, you love to talk with people about Jesus. You love to get to know them. You love to spend time with them. You love to do things with them. We're afraid you're never going to ask them for money. You're just going to enjoy being with them. And I said, wow, if that really is what you've got to not be, and these guys, if you want to call me this, Larry, you can call me this if you want to. I know Larry through Jesus Film. He would call me Vinny. He was a little bit of an older guy, right? Vince, Vinny, you get it. Italian, everybody wants a cousin Vinny. We can cover that another time. So he would say to me, Vinny, 2 things you need to be sure of if you're going to be good at fundraising. You'll never leave money on the table. And when people see you walking down the street, you want them to walk to the other side of the street, because they know a fundraising ask is coming. And I was like, man, I'm going to be really bad at fundraising. I don't want any of those things to be true, right? So I had a good friend of mine who at the time was president of InterVarsity, and I said to him, Jim, I'm going to be a horrible fundraiser, but I think God's called me to be the president's organization. And he said, have you ever heard of the focus group? And I said, no. And I got introduced to Brad and another one of our consultants, Zach, and they actually said, Vince, you could be a great fundraiser. You like people. You're okay with not always getting every dollar squeezed out of every person and have them running out of the room after you. And I was like, yeah, that's true. So I just want to encourage you all. I know that you're all directors of development. You've all this experience, and you're wise beyond even the years you've done. But there are a lot of people working for you who are in their first day or have been around for a while, and they feel a little insecure because they love people, they love Jesus. This isn't the reason why they got into gospel ministry. They feel like God is trying to utilize them in this role, and they're trying to figure out, God, how do I do this and still really love people? And I can tell you that's why I work for the focus group now, is that I ended up learning after a $20-some million capital campaign and raising a lot of money for the organization I work for that actually God does want to bless this, and what a way to invest my life. So it's an honor to be here with you.
And in reference to the leaving money on the table thing, I don't have a mic, but I'm still being recorded. The founder of the focus group, when I was young, he said to me, Brad, don't be afraid to leave money on the table. It's a direct opposite. He said, don't be afraid to leave money on the table. I said, why? And he said, because you make a commitment to never leave the table.
Yes.
Stay in relationship with people over a lifetime. And from a year to year, you might not ask them for the best gift, but if you're in a committed relationship with a person for a long period of time, you're fine. And it's so refreshing. So it's so opposite of your...
And you literally said that to me when I was like, Brad, but I can't leave money on the table. And you were like, but Vince, you're never leaving the table. Why wouldn't you? And I was like, oh, he's right. All right. So this framework is, as Brad mentioned earlier, this is the framework that we utilize and as we encourage missional organizations like you all. So first is a case, right? And so what is a case for fundraising? I know in Crew you all have them. For campaigns, we have one with Jesus Film. I know many of you have annual cases. So what is it? Well, it's the clearest articulation of your mission and how you fulfill that mission, right? And I know for some of us, like I just went overboard telling you about how relational I am, how we encourage people to be relational. Brad talked about that a lot, and now you're saying, but Vince, you're telling me to have this document that I've got to hold in my hand and talk with people. That feels like the least relational thing I could possibly do. It can, but remember, it's a conversation piece, right? So you're really just saying, hey, here's a missionally aligned friend, patron, partner, and they're really saying like, Vince, help me understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, because I think God wants me to invest in this, but I just need to know more. And can you articulate it clearly, right? I can tell a fun story every now and again, but can I really clearly articulate a mission and vision? And can we do it consistently within our ministry, right? And that's what a case allows us to do. So it's got a budget, it's got a proposed strategy to raise the funding, it includes deliverables and measurable outcomes, right? We're trying to include people, right? We know that people want to give to us because they like us, they believe in our mission, they know the history of our mission, but they also want to know, where are you going? Why do you believe God's calling you to that? And what do you think it's going to look like after you do it, right? And that's really what a case articulates really well. How's it used? As I said earlier, it's in-person meetings. So this is not the shiny brochure that you pull together and you send out to your entire mailing list, right? That's not what this is. It is not, though there's an element of marketing to it, it's not a marketing tool. It's a conversation piece, right? And so you're doing it with prospective donors or individuals, and they know ahead of time what you're going to be doing. Right? So the last thing, this is the other person who, by the way, when I tell stories about this guy, similar to what Brad said about his book, like, you never use the names of people. I'm not going to use the name of this person, not that you even know him. I want you to know he's a good man who loves Jesus and has shared the gospel with many people, and he and I have a really super fun relationship. So I don't want you to hear me as talking poorly about this guy. There are times even when I tell him what I do, he was like, I could raise more money than the way you do it. And I'm like, that's fine. You can still have people run away from you. I'm not going to do that anymore. So, but one of the things that he would say is, never tell them ahead of time that you might ask them for money, because they'll say no to the meeting. What we would say is, actually, to honor the relationship, you should let them know why you're meeting with them, right? So let them know, hey, I'm getting together with you. I mean, one of the fun things I get to do with clients sometimes is, if we're not making a financial ask, and remember your title, many of you, is Director of Development, Vice President of Development. If you get a call from a Director of Development, why do you think you're getting that phone call, right? So it's very nice to start and go, hey, Jim, just giving you a call today, want to let you know, not making a financial ask today, just wanted to check in, right? Because you all may be friendly, but you are still the VP, Director of Development, Advancement, whatever your title is. So if you are going to make a financial ask, we want to honor people and say, hey, I just want to sit down with you. We've been talking about what's going on in Crew. I just want to let you know where we believe God's calling us and what we're trusting the Lord for, and would love to walk this through with you and your wife. Are you okay with that? Could we do that sometime soon? Would love to come to your home and have that conversation. And who is it for? It's for major donors. Again, this isn't for everybody on the list, right? This isn't for the 100,000 that we're sending it out for. It's a conversation piece of that. Remember when Brad earlier was talking about developing a strategy for prospects? These are the people that you've kind of developed a bit of a strategy for, and you're thinking about, okay, how do we engage them a little more deeply, and how do we bring them in as what they are? We want to treat people as what they are, which is partners in the ministry, right? Sometimes we use the term partner, not in this room, but more broadly, we say partner, and what we really mean is you're a person that gives money. That's it, right? Well, that's not partnership, that's an element of partnership, right? Deeper partnership is actually saying, no, we believe that God has called a community of people around this ministry, and you're one of those people. So I really want to share with you what we believe God's calling us to, and how you can engage that more deeply. And here's a document. Could you give us feedback? Could you pray with us through this document? Could we be teammates in what we believe the strategy is that God's
Now,
calling
before
us to?
Vince walks you through, I will take the mic now so I don't run out of voice. So before Vince walks you through the elements that are in a case statement, because how many of you have a case statement that you're regularly using? You use a tool when you meet with major donors. How many of you have it? Okay, that is a lot less than I was expecting. But if we have, there's 10 things that need to be in one of these documents. We're going to explain them. But let's take a second. If it's for major donors, what do you think a major donor is? Does anybody have an idea what a major donor is? What do you think? An investor, but like, what's a major donor to your work?
15,000 up.
10 or 15 up. Does anybody have a different number? 1,000, 5,000. What was your number? 5,000, right? Dave, what's the major donor to a Jesus film?
10 and up.
10 and up. Okay, everybody's got a different definition of a major donor, right? And so major donors are a relative to your budget or to your specific need. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But like the idea is if you're, if you're the president of a ministry that's raising $100 million, your definition of a major donor is different than the school that I helped start in St. Augustine that needs to raise about $350,000 a year, right? But so a major donor is relative to your unique situation, and this document is what we use for the donors that are the largest givers to our organization. So I want to just dispel the myth that a major donor is anybody that gives more than $10,000, right? That's not the right answer. Really, if you have a budget of $10 million or more, a major donor probably, actually to the organization, probably needs to be a donor that's giving $300,000 or more, or $250,000, or has the potential to give $250,000 or more. So just wanted to define that because I feel like it's so vague that it might be people thinking different things. But so Vince, tell us, there's 10 elements in a good case statement. What are they?
Well, Brad, I'm glad you asked. We actually have a slide that indicates what those might be. All right. So what are the 10 elements of a case for support? And we will actually walk you through a case here a little bit later on in our presentation. But the key elements are a theme and title page, right? So a theme, what are you doing, right? So as we've talked about a few different times, we're working with Jesus Film right now, and they have a case statement for their campaign for what the artist formerly known as the Animated Story of Jesus is now just called Jesus, right? So what is the theme, right? For many of you, what are you trying to accomplish over the next 3 years, right? There's a mission organization that I'm working with right now that their theme is going further, wider, and deeper, right? So they're talking about what does it look like for us missionally to go further, to go deeper with some of the missional organizations we work with, and go wider and deeper, right? So what is the theme? How do you articulate who you are and where you're going? It's normally inspirational. That title page, there's also normally a letter from one of the leaders, like the Jesus Film one. Right inside of it, we got a nice letter from Josh Newell, right? So what does it look like to develop a theme for your next year or handful of years?
And is need how much money we need?
No, Brad, it's not. I'm glad you asked. Need is actually the need. So do you exist? So an example that I would use is I was talking to an organization that was thinking about hiring the focus group. And they said to me, Vince, we're really excited to work with the focus group. And I said, well, we're excited to work with you. What do you need? And the person said to me, we need $7 million. And I said, Wow, awesome. So why do you need $7 million? And they said, well, we need $7 million. And I was like, okay, you're never going to raise $7 million that way, right? Do you exist because you need $7 million? Or is there a reason, the way that we say it is there a reason that God allows your ministry to exist? Because he's the God of the universe. If he didn't want your ministry to exist, guess what? It's not going to exist. But for some reason, he's allowing it to exist. He wants it to exist. It's fulfilling his mission here on earth as it is in heaven. So if that's the case, why? Right? So you articulate that, and then it's obviously meeting a need, right? So, the really easy one is, the clean water initiatives that we see all over the place. Like, what is the need? The need isn't $7 million, though they may need $7 million to drill new wells and get clean water. Their need is to get clean water to people all over Uganda or whatever the Clean Water Initiative is, right? So the need, as Brad so lobbed the softball to me, the need is not a financial need to start off with. It's why does God allow your ministry to exist, and what need is it meeting or fulfilling? Okay?
Yeah, what problem exists in the world that your organization can help?
Yep. Next, your mission, right? Why do you exist? And you'd be surprised, and especially with the scale and scope of many of the crew ministries that are in here, you may be able to articulate the mission of why you exist. Maybe that's for larger crew, or specifically, Josh McDowell or Jesus Film or AIA or whatever it might be. But does everyone know that, right? And do your partners know that, right? If you really sat down with them and said, what is the mission of AIA? Maybe some of your partners would know it, but would all of them? And is there a really clean way that you can articulate it to them so they would be able to engage it? So we want to talk mission. Lifetime value, right? So for many of you, especially, your ministry has existed for some time now, right? So you're not, to Brad's example of the classical Christian school that he and his wife started in St. Augustine, it's been around for 8 years, right? So they can start to talk about lifetime value over the last 8 years, but it's a shorter lifetime. With many of you all, you've got an incredibly winsome story to tell, right? Within crew over the lifetime. What sparked inside of Dr. Bill Bright how many years ago, and what has that spark that Jesus lit, what inferno is blazing now? And can we tell that story in a way that talks about over the lifetime of the ministry, this is what God's done?
And usually it takes the form of a human story. Like it's not, we're going to talk about statistics in a minute. It's not 6 million people have accepted Christ. That's not. It's tell the story of a child in Uganda that met Jesus after watching this Jesus film. Like the lifetime value is best illustrated through a story. Like I was arguing with a person at a conference, and he said major donors just want data. And I was like, and he's like, that's all they want, ROI. They want to see big ROI on their investments as major donors. And I was like, it is important to give data, and it is important to give ROI, but it's really important to give that the context of human life that was changed, right? And so in St. Augustine, I get to talk about the lifetime value of Young Life because I used to be the area director. I still give money. I've been the board chair, all these things, right? But in St. Augustine, the mayor, the president of Flagler College, and the pastor of the largest church in town, when I was the area director at that time, president of the college, pastor of the largest church, and the mayor, they had something in common. They all committed their lives to Christ in high school, in Young Life. And so it was really interesting to be able to say, why give money to Young Life? Because they become the pastor, the mayor, and the president of the college, right? That's the lifetime value of your investment. And so that human story in lifetime value is super important because data is data, right? Like I love data, but I can't remember it, right? Maybe you can, but I can't remember if it was 50,000 or like really, I can't remember. I was so impressed when Josh said how many people had committed their lives to Christ through the Jesus film. And I can't remember. How many people? 600 and something million. I have been afraid to say that because the number is so amazing. I keep using the 6, but I think it's 60 million or is it 600 million?
Yeah.
That's amazing. But I want to hear the Jesus film tell the story of a person in a village who becomes the pastor, becomes the person of influence, and becomes the country's president, all because they watched the Jesus film. That's the story I want to see. And then how do we do that? We have these lives that are transformed, but how does program relate to that?
I'm glad you asked, Brad. So I could be a game show host if this doesn't work out. So
Pat
program.
Sajak is retiring.
That's right. Who's taking over for him? Have they announced it?
Yes, they have.
It doesn't matter. All right. So program. So what do you do and how do you do it? Right. So what do you do and how do you do it? Right. Really getting a little more tactical here and a little more granular. As Brad explained earlier, we want to explain things, but there's a certain level of detail that certain people want. And one of the things that we talk about cases, I should have said this earlier, is sometimes they're vertical tools and sometimes they're horizontal tools. I just did the opposite. Horizontal, vertical, right? And so what we mean by that is, so the person that Brad spoke with at that conference, right, that is a person who wants a vertical tool, right? They're like, get me down to that one detail and that one data point that I need to know and that I really care about, right? I want the ROI, I want to know the stats. Great, we're going to have that in here. The majority of people want more of a horizontal tool, right? So they just want to say, hey, look, give me the big picture of what you're doing. Tell me some stories. Help me understand what God's doing and how he's moving. And that's the way that I want to engage. And so program gives us an opportunity to do both. It gives us the stats and data of the work that we do, but it also gives us the opportunity to talk big picture of what we do and how we do it. Accomplishments, right? So because our ministry exists, what has happened, right? So we've articulated a pretty great number from the Lifetime of the Jesus film. But I know Crew Collegiate has some pretty amazing stories. Athletes in Action, some pretty amazing stories, right? So because we've existed, what has God done, right? And we want to be thoughtful in the way we deflect the glory, right? So it's not because of Crew, it's God has allowed Crew, Jesus has worked through Crew to do, right, those kind of things. Because we want in our own hearts to make sure that what's the little meme, check your own heart, right? Check your heart. We want to make sure that we're talking about what Jesus has done, but for some reason, he's allowed us to be a tool in that story, right? And those are our accomplishments.
What's interesting about Vision for the Future is you have two different versions of a case statement. You have the one that we use for the Redoing the Jesus film. That's a campaign. But then most of us are not in campaigns, and we have to raise money this year for our ministry to exist. And so our vision for the future is what are you, for the annual work, is what do we hope to see God accomplish through our work this year, right? Because it's visionary to think that our work will continue. What are we going to accomplish? And so we have to have a short-term vision and then a long-term vision, like lives transformed. Like I've had the privilege of also serving InterVarsity for 14 years since I got to the focus group. And it has been so fun to watch God change their outlook, right? So when we first got to InterVarsity's president at the time, Alec Hill, came to us and said, Brad, we have a lot of people on staff with InterVarsity. They all raise their own support. We don't have a development department. If you could help us raise $1 million, it would really allow us to do some really strategic things. And so we went through our little process and came back to Alec and told Alec, actually, Alec, based on what we're seeing, we actually think you can raise $10 million. And so Alec, being obviously president, $10 million, 10 times what he thought, overjoyed, they launched into this campaign, which was a campaign, first ever for InterVarsity. They raised $14 million. So it was wildly successful. Now, that campaign ended, and obviously Alec Hill was still the president. What did he do? He's like, wow, that was good. Let's do it again. And so they wrote a new strategic vision for the future. And that new plan, and we went out and tested it, we told them they could raise $34 million. Like, donors don't get fatigued. When you treat donors properly and you care for them, they move in, right? And so we told them that they could raise $34 million. They launched that campaign. In the middle of that campaign, Alec Hill got sick. And that's when Steve Lundgren took over as the interim. And we finished that campaign, and it finished at $51 million, right? And so that campaign ended. Now Tom Lynn is the president of InterVarsity. They write a new strategic plan. Now this is where I come fully alive, because I could care less about money. Like, I actually see money as the vehicle to having the gospel brought around the world, right? So now InterVarsity has this confidence. They've raised $50 million. Their board begins to get a vision. And their vision was, what if we had a gospel presence on every campus in the US? And they went to the CCO and the Crew, and they formed this 2030 calling. And they said, what would it take if by 2030 there could be a witnessing community for Christ on every campus in the US? And there's a little asterisk, every campus. It's like over 250 students and so on and so forth. But it includes community colleges And it includes every, larger 250 person or more. And so then we got to help them launch campaign number 3, which was for $81 million. But the reason that it's significant is not that it's about the $80 million. It's because now an organization is saying, let's have Jesus be on every campus. Do college students need Christ? Absolutely. And so somehow the fundraising freed their board to begin to dream the things that they always wanted. Did InterVarsity, a 70-year-old organization, want to be on every campus? Absolutely. But suddenly their fundraising success gave them a vision, and that's when the 2030 calling, that campaign we launched for $81 million. We ended it about 2 years ago, and it ended at $88 million, which was great. And now we are just launching into the fourth campaign with them, which will probably be about the same amount of money. Like, it's about $80 million campaign. And the pandemic was really disruptive to a lot of their growth, as it was for a lot of college ministries. And so I'm not sure they're going to get to the 2030 to have a witnessing community for Christ, but their donors are with it. So this vision for the future, it's important. It is both this year and it is our big dreams. I actually think this is what God's called me into life to do, is to help ministry leaders look up and say, if money were no object, this is what we would do. Most ministry leaders are down here going, if I could just make budget, if I could just keep the lights on, and they're afraid to share I'm like, well, what would you say if you were whispering in a dark room? What would your real vision be? They're like, well, if money were no object, this is what I'd really like to do. Okay, well, that's what I think God's called me to do, is help people look up, to have a vision to transform the world for the gospel. And so the vision for the future is super important. And my own story with it was when I was a brand new fundraiser, and I was 3 years into it, and Bill had helped me put together my very first case statement. And I used the case statement as a direct fundraiser on the Vision for the Future page. We had the dream for our work, and then we had this big vision in St. Augustine that we would somehow figure out a way to reach minority folks, people of color in St. Augustine. St. Augustine has a really interesting history with racial relations. Like, it is the center of the civil rights movement, and there's a lot of pain there. And our work at Young Life had always just been white kids, white middle-class kids. And so we had this vision of that, like, is there some way that we could reach into a different part of our community? And so in the vision page, it actually listed that as a goal that the board had been praying about God doing something. And I'm meeting with this donor who happened to be the mayor, right? So tell me about the mayor in St. Augustine. He came, right. So I'm meeting with the mayor, and I'm there asking him for his $5,000 gift. He was a major donor because the budget was a lot smaller. And then he gets to this vision page, and he looks at the bottom, and he said, I didn't know that you wanted to start work with inner city kids in St. Augustine. It's on the page, right? And I said, yeah, we really do. And I shared about the board and praying and our vision. He said, well, did you know that I'm on the board of the Buckingham Smith Foundation? And I said, no. And he said, do you know what the Buckingham Smith Foundation is? I said, no. And he said, well, it's a foundation. This guy was friends with Henry Flagler. He left his entire estate for African-American folks in St. Augustine. And you can't ask us for money because we don't receive requests, but I'm on the board. How much do you need? And I'm not lying. That conversation was 1996. And so how many years ago is that? Like 28 years ago?
Yeah,
and so Joe, my friend Joe, got them 28 years ago to give $50,000 to pay for the work. And for 28 years, the Buckingham Smith Foundation in St. Augustine has given that size gift or larger, right? And it all was because we had been praying about this vision for something different, right? And so this vision page, it's like, it's got to be, what do we want to do this year? But there's got to be something bigger, because people give to the bigger. But it's scary, right? And so, boy, I just talked a long time about point number 7, but
that's
I get
all right.
very excited. I said this is what I was called to do.
You said this is what you're called to do. If you were just like, well, this vision for the future, let's move on.
Okay.
No, and yeah, it's. Oh, his battery's dying too. So, but it is really critical. You all know this. People give to vision, right? People give to vision. They want to know what God's doing and what you're trusting Him for, and what you see is happening in different campuses or different spaces or different worlds or whatever it might be. So financial needs, right? So this all has a cost and it all has a budget, and it's connected to something. And so we always have a page or multiple pages where we're really connecting vision to budget, right? Because we know that that's true, right? So one of the things that my clients that I work with often get tired of hearing from me, but I say it quite often because we say it quite often, is you're not raising money for a campaign. It is a campaign. You are raising money for it, but you're raising money for a vision, right? And you're having a campaign in order to raise money for the vision. So we want it, that's true, so we want the financial needs page or pages to connect the dots for people that there's a vision and this is the money that we're going to need in order to accomplish this vision. We're not just raising money to raise money, it's for this vision, right? And now the next one is the gift plan, which Brad talked about. Remember, one of the principles was people give because they are asked and they're shown how. So this is the place where my board was very nervous that I would blink because I like people. Remember that? I like people. I'll be bad at fundraising. So there's a gift plan, right? And what it does is it gives people the opportunity, two opportunities. One, it gives them the opportunity to kind of really think and pray about, oh, these are the kind of gifts that they need in order to accomplish this vision. Right? And if you remember, Brad said earlier, about 60 donors, especially when you're in a campaign, about 60 donors are going to make about 90% of a campaign, right? So we have about 60 opportunities. Now, it's not 60 numbers all the way down, but it's 10 people at this level, 15 people at this level. But we've also got that lead gift number, right? And so we sit down with people and we say, you know, you've heard everything we believe God's doing. This is where we are. And so this is what we're asking people to pray about. And we normally are going to kind of circle, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we kind of circle a range. Rarely do we ask people for a very specific gift, and Brad and I will talk about that a little bit later, but we kind of give them a range. Now, we do that for two reasons, like I said. One, for people to look at it and go, oh, this is where I might see myself. But it's also really helpful, and I don't know what Brad articulated earlier about, you know, when I said, yeah, my daughter's friend is at Boston College, and they're going on this mission trip, and they asked for $20,000, but it just said, would you pray about giving a gift? And to Brad's point, I actually did read it and say, are they asking me for $20,000? No, I think this went out to a bunch of people. So maybe they're asking me for $20 and they're looking for a bunch of people to do it. Maybe they want 100. So I actually called my friend's daughter, who we grew up together, and I was like, hey, Mary, it's Mr. Burens. And she was like, I knew I shouldn't have sent you that letter. And I was like, no, Mary, why would you say that? And she was like, because I know that you're a fundraising consultant and I knew that you were going to critique my letter. And I was like, now, Mary, I'm not critiquing your letter. However, I do have a few questions.
However.
And my question really to her was, Mary, what would you like me to give? And she was like, well, I don't know. They don't really tell us. You know, she's a 20-year-old, right? And she knows that she's talking to someone who does this for a living. And I was like, honey, let me make this easy on you. Pretty much whatever you ask, like they're some of our closest friends in the world. She and my daughter are best friends, right? Honey, whatever you ask, I'm probably going to give you. So what do you need? And she was like, well, Mr. Burens, we were told that if we could just raise $250 total, and I sent letters out to 10 people. And I was like, oh, what if I gave you $100? She was like, that would be amazing. That would blow my mind. Now, candidly, I was going in thinking that it was going to be a lot more than that. So I was like, really, $100 and I almost got half budget? All right, I'm a win. I'm a hero.
But she's not leaving the table.
She's not leaving the table. Mary is definitely not leaving the table. But to that point, right, what our donors, don't you want to kind of know where people see you? It doesn't mean that, like if she would have said, well, actually, Mr. Burens, I sent it to you and I was hoping you give $20,000. I can't give $20,000. But it would have been good to know that that's kind of the kind of donor that she saw me to be, right? Donors want to know, where do we see them, right? Where do we see them? When I tell people the story, so we're trying to raise, as David said earlier, $150 million for Jesus Film, for this new film, right? When I talk to my classical Christian school client that's trying to raise $6 million for a new gym, they go, how could Jesus Film raise $150 million and we can't even imagine raising $6 million for a new gym? Well, it's scale, right? It's scale, it's vision. Not that the gym's a bad vision, right? But when someone says, I'm trying to raise $6 million for a particular gym, I'm thinking of a kind of number if I'm a major donor. If someone comes to me and says, we're raising $150 million to create a new film that's going to reach the 12 countries that are the least reached and probably reach the rest of the world for the gospel, that's probably a bigger number that I'm going to think about than the gym in central Pennsylvania, right? And neither of those things are bad. They're all within God's economy equal, right? We know that. But it helps the donor kind of get their mind around, where should my giving be and how should I think about giving? Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
We had a case statement a few years ago, and we didn't use it a whole lot, but we really only effectively used it with one person who was our largest donor. And she kept saying to us on two I want to be your largest donor. And so our top line on it was $500,000. So we presented it to her, and I said, you know, you've told me twice you want to be our largest donor. This is what it looks like.
Yeah.
And she says, you're challenging me. And I said, that's right. And she said, I'll do it.
Yeah. Great. And that's a great story, because donors want to know, and remember Brad earlier was talking about people that are just generous by nature, like giving is a way of life. Those kind of people want to know. When I was running the collegiate ministry that I was running previously, there was an Indiana farmer not far outside of Fort Wayne, Kendallville, as a matter of fact. Yeah, you know Kendallville. So he always used to have me out. People talk about being outdoorsy. I'm indoorsy. So I am not like the people that buy the Patagonia and have the backpacks and have the little sucky thing. Like, that's not me. I'm the opposite of that person, right? I grew up in a city. I'm an urban person. Like, that's the way that I function. But he was a farmer guy, so I used to go to his farm. He'd take me out on the farm. He got a huge kick out of it because I would get dirty and I felt ridiculous, and he thought it was great, right? But he always used to ask me. He also ran the largest fabricating plant in Kendallville, Indiana, that sold exclusively to John Deere, and he did quite well for himself. And he felt like God told him, yeah, you're writing down notes now. He felt like God told him that he needed to reinvest that money, and he was generous by nature, and he would always ask me, what's the largest gift you've been given this year? And he didn't do it for his ego, if you would know him. He gave it because he wanted to be generous, and he felt like God told him to be generous. So part of me pointing to a gift on the gift plan wasn't to stroke his ego. It wasn't for me to just get the biggest gift. It was to bless him with what he felt like God had given him. Last and certainly not least, leadership profile. This is one of those things that you might think like, this is a little silly, like why do we have a listing of all the executive leaders and the board members and advisory members and all those kind of things? You would be surprised, as Brad mentioned earlier, we do these things called feasibility studies where we sit down with your donors and we ask them, we kind of have a confidential interview where we ask them, what do you think about the ministry? What do you think about this project? They're trying to raise a bunch of money for, all that kind of stuff. You would be surprised, I am surprised, at how quickly people flip to the back page and will say, oh yeah, I know that board member. Oh, they work for Alcoa. I didn't realize that they had someone who worked. Oh, really? They have someone who's in the tech industry on their board out in California. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize. You would be stunned at how quickly people do that. And why do they do it? Because it lends credibility, right? It lends credibility. It kind of communicates to people like, oh, if Jim Smith is a part of this and I know Jim Smith and I really trust him and believe in him, then this might be an okay place for me to invest my money too, right? And so those are the key elements of a case statement.
Is it the leadership of the ministry or the leadership of the board?
Yes, to answer your question. Yes, you are correct. Oh, so both.
Well, thank you, Vince. And so I was surprised at how few of you are using an active case statement right now. So maybe that's your big takeaway, that you need to go back to your organizations and work on creating a case statement. What I would actually say, though, because not a lot of you raised your hand, is that you have all these things in different documents. Like in development, our job is to fund the dream, not to create the dream. And so all of these things exist. Maybe the gift plan, it doesn't exist anywhere, but you can create that, right? But the budget exists, the mission, the need that you're responding to. You could just ask 10 people when you think of our organization, what comes to mind, what action words, and they're going to say something like transforming or building hope, or they're going to tell, the theme will just emerge. And so you think that you got to create a case statement. I would suggest to you that it exists, and it's probably 7 or 8 different documents. And if you pull them together, you could have a really great tool to use with a major donor. And so we got this, yes, right, our new person is raising. Hi.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, question.
You mentioned when you do the vision for the future, you gave an example of kind of I just have a vision for where do you feel it's important to call?
Well, in an annual fund, when you're raising money for your annual needs, not a capital campaign, you want to have the vision of what you want to accomplish this year. That is vision, because you haven't accomplished it yet. But then you want to ask your executive director, or if you're the president of the ministry, what is the board, what is in your strategic plan in the future? What does God put on your heart, right? So you want to have that as a separate section, but if it's the document you're using on an annual, you want to talk about what are our vision for this year, and then what is our vision, some bigger items in the future that might work. Whereas if it's a capital campaign, your vision is really just the funding of the project that you're raising all the money for. It's not into the details of what you want to do this year. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is the vision, to paint the vision for the future without the funding, Like, if we don't do this, this is what's going to happen. And that is I've seen it before. It's not my favorite. Like, that sounds like we're scaring people into giving, and I would rather motivate people to giving. I mean, you did say it was a secular presentation, and so that doesn't surprise me. That feels like a tactic. I like to invite people into transforming the world for Christ rather than them scaring them to give money. Okay, so we got this case statement. Remember I said case statement. Okay, so we have the message, why we exist, what it's going to cost, and the vision for the future. Who carries that message? It's carried by leadership, right? And leadership is like, it's not male. This was the school I helped start, just for fun. I put it up there. Veritas, cultivating, that's our theme, is cultivating. But leadership, it really takes the form of two groups. It's both staff and volunteers. Staff and volunteers need how many of you are volunteers in the room? Okay, so we got 3 or 4 of you that are volunteers. Most of you are on staff, and you're getting paid, which is amazing, right? I'm getting paid to be here today. Well, I don't know if I am, but it's okay. I'm so thankful. I get paid from the focus group, so I'm staff, right?
Yeah.
And so, but the point is that, like, staff, we are representing an organization and we are earning our living, and that's awesome. But the volunteer component to leadership is so much more powerful. When a major donor says to their friend, I love this organization and here's why I give money, that means so much more than you as a staff person. And so the idea of equipping our volunteers with case statements that they wind up sharing with their friends is amazing. So several years ago, I was younger on staff. I was learning my fundraising stuff by being a practitioner, and our board had this great idea that we would put on a hoedown, okay? And we would invite lots of people, and we would auction off things, and we'd sell tickets, and we'd dance, and we'd eat barbecue, right? And so this was our great idea. Nobody in the room has ever had good ideas like that before, I bet. And part of it was to get every one of our board members involved in getting auction items, selling tickets, and showing up and bringing their friends. And I had this one board member who was in his 80s. His name is Bill Thurman. He actually lived in Ponte Vedra, which is pretty wealthy, okay? And Bill said, you know, Brad, he was from Atlanta, Brad, Jenny and I are getting older, and I don't like to drive at night, so I can't come to the auction. And of course, I responded like any good person. I was like, oh, you'll be fine. You should come anyways. And he's like, no, I can't. And he said, but I do have a couple friends I would like to share the story of what's happening. Can you send me some of those case statements that you used with me? And I was like, well, okay, but if you're not going to support our event, I'm really frustrated, you know. And so I sent him the case statements. We had that event. It was pretty hard, and I literally lost 2 board members over it because I was pushing so hard to get people to do projects. Bill calls me the next day after the auction, and he, as a volunteer, and he says, Brad, I shared the case statement with my friend that I would have taken to the event if I had come to the event. And he said, but by the way, how did your event go? And I said, oh, it was hard. We did okay, but I think we netted about $5,000. And he says, well, that's great, but my friend, I took him out to lunch. I shared with him the case statement. I talked to him about why I like to give. I told him what I gave, and then I asked him if he'd join me in giving. I said, well, what did he say, Bill? And he said, well, he said he'd give $5,000 this year, and if it's as good as I say it is, he's going to give a lot more next year, right? And so I burned out my committee. I put on an event that was marginal at best, and I had one volunteer do the right thing the right way, right? And so the case statement really needs to be delivered by both staff and volunteers. And part of your job is to, remember I talked about forming a leadership team, like amongst your caseload. Who are the people that will actually help you, who will go on meetings with you, who want to give their testimony about how great that your work is. Now, leadership, so you have the message, we'll get back to the 5 things. We have the message, it's carried by staff and volunteers, and who is it carried to? Practically speaking, it's carried to donors or partners or prospects. But Vince, Do we carry it to everybody the same way? And how do we figure out how to do it? Tell us about prospects. You get the mic back.
All right. We don't, Brad. No, we don't. We actually, so prospects. The first question is, and I'm sure any of you that have been in fundraising, partnership development for a long time, you have heard this before, right? Who are your best donors? Your current donors. Thank you. If I had like a rubber hat to give away, I would totally give you a gift. Yeah. So the first question we need to ask is not who do we need to get to, but who are our current donors, right? Who do we currently have? Who's in our database? Who's already given? Maybe they haven't given in a little while. Maybe they give every year. But who are they, right? Do we know actually who they are, not just their names in an Excel spreadsheet, or in TNT MPD? I don't think you all use that anymore, but you used to, right? So do we actually know who they are and what they're about? Are they lapsed, right? If they did lapse, why are they lapsed, right? Is it because that person that they were supporting on crew staff left staff? Is it because something happened and they were offended and nobody followed up with them? Did they just give $1,000 a year and then 1 year just stopped giving and then the money never came back again? Why did they stop giving? How do we evaluate our donors, right? Who are they? What are they about? How do we tier them? How do we think about them, right? So one of the questions that Brad asked earlier was, do we think about every donor the same way? And the answer is no, right? We all have to be strategic with our time. Now, that doesn't mean we value people differently, but it does mean the way that we invest our time based off the community that God's brought around our mission gets spent differently, right? I told the story about the Indiana farmer. Well, the Indiana farmer got a lot of my time, right? As the president and CEO of the organization, as the chief fundraiser of the organization. Why did he do that? Was he more important than the person that gave $5 a month? Absolutely not. However, from an investment of my time, I knew that I needed to be with him at least once a quarter to see him, to spend time with him, to hear stories about his family, and ultimately to ask him to keep giving into the mission. So how do we evaluate our donors? How do we think about them? Are we noticing their generosity, right? Active listening, Brad talked about that earlier when we're thinking about our donors, just asking questions. Who do you give to? What really animates you? What's just super fun for you to do and be a part of, really, and try to understand that and how our mission overlaps. How do they connect to you or your school or your mission or whatever it might be? How do they connect to you? What's the overlap? Why did they start giving? Was it because there was a particular person that worked for AIA that was their, son-in-law? Is it because they just love the mission? Is it someone who gives a crew collegiate because they're like me? They're two people, a husband and wife, that didn't grow up in the faith and became Christians in college, and they were like, we just want to give because we want more college students to hear about Jesus, right? Like, what's the reason what's their overlap and how are they connected? Do they have financial capacity, right? And how do we begin to source that and understand whether or not they have financial capacity? As Brad said earlier, this shouldn't always be number one, right? So it's not, let's go find the really wealthy people and let's ask them to give, right? We want to make sure how they're connected and how they overlap. But it's important to know, do they have particular capacity, right? And many of you know that you have missionaries and staff people who are on campus who have that donor that's been giving them $1,000 a year for 10 years, and you've done some sort of a wealth screening or some sort of follow-up, and you're like, oh wow, that person's the CEO of Interstate Battery, right? I'm telling a real life story. So that for us, I had a staff person who was doing collegiate ministry, who was from Texas, who got $1,000 a year from this really nice person, and they would always say, oh, Mr. Sepulveda, he's just like the nicest guy in the world, and we've always been so grateful. And we go to their house, then they invite us to their ranch in Texas, and then we've been to their house in Turks and Caicos, and then they took us to Italy, and I'm like, wait a second. This person gives you $1,000 a year and they're going to all these things? Who are these people? Oh, he's the CEO of Interstate Battery. Yeah, but I don't think they're that rich. I think that they just, and it's like, okay, we're not just going in.
Timeshares in all those places.
They just have timeshares. They actually just know people. No, they actually own homes in all of those places, right? So now this isn't the opportunity to just make a blind money grab, right? But it is an opportunity to say, okay, this person who has significant capacity, for some reason God has allowed to overlap with our mission, and really loves this staff person, is this an opportunity or a conversation we should have? Not a financial ask. No, don't fly into Texas and say, we give $1 million, but an opportunity to say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Sepulveda, thank you so much for your generosity to the staff person. I just wanted to let you know this is what we're doing more broadly and the multiplicative effect of making investments, and not here to make a financial ask today, but just want to connect and hear your heart and why you started giving to this staff person and ... right? So do they have financial capacity? And even helping our staff understand, maybe a greater financial capacity for some of the folks that have been supporting them. And as Brad articulated, I thought really well earlier, are they givers, right? Everybody wants to know the billionaire, right? Everybody knows the most famous CEO in their town, right? But if they don't love Jesus, or even if they do love Jesus, and they're not people that love to give, is it worth trying to spend a little time with them and develop a relationship and see if God's going to, encourage them to give to your mission? Maybe. But where it's really fun, and Brad articulated this earlier, is to really think about the people that just giving is a way of life. They want to outgive people. They want to know that, like, man, God's given me this, and if I could just reinvest it, I'm just a steward. I don't own anything in this world, really. God's just given me a field for a season of life, and it's my job to distribute the fruits from that field as best I can and however I can. And look at that. Like, it's not always money. So again, I didn't plan on telling a bunch of Indiana farmer stories, but apparently that's my day. The way the Indiana farmer started giving was he would give me a half a cow every year. Now, not a like literally slaughtered, cut in half. Normally the head, which I was really grateful for. No, it was a butchered, which actually that's a question I could have asked before I got the half of cow the first time. But he just gave me and my family meat, right? Unsolicited. I got 5 banana boxes of frozen beef, right? Now you may look. I know it's really good
Where
too.
did you put it?
I had to go buy a deep freezer because I didn't have a place to put it, right? But it was delicious. Now you may look at that and go, well, he's an Indiana farmer who just gave you a bunch of beef. Okay. But this is a guy who just wants to be generous, right? And he's saying, whatever my means are, I have cattle. I want to give that away. I have money. I want to give that away. I've got land. I want to give that away, right? I want to give away whatever I can because that's the way I live. He's a giver. So how do we sort of suss out if someone's a giver and really engage them to allow them to be blessed because it's how God's created them?
So when you look at prospects, what we're trying to get you to do is evaluate who's on your list and who's on your brain and give you a framework for figuring out who you should be prioritizing. Now, this next slide is sort of begins the strategy work, right? And so we can't, I don't want to think of people as like levels of donors. I don't want to overdo it, but I do want to think about that word, which is in the first two, ability, okay? So whatever your fundraising goal is, in my mind, you're prioritizing, or you're creating a strategy around a tier 1 donor is they have the ability to give 3% or more of your goal. So you said you have about 100, Don, you have about 100 people in your portfolio. How much money do you need to raise annually? About?
Let's say $1 million.
$1 million. So for Don, which is an easy number to do the math on, he needs to, a tier 1 donor is someone who has the ability to give 30,000 or more, right? And there's not going to be a lot of people out of that 100 that have that ability. But he needs to design a strategy for his tier 1 donors that's highly relational, that has him face to face with those donors about 4 times a year. You need to be praying for them every day. You need to know the names of their grandkids, and they're really a personalized approach. Whereas a tier 2 donor is a donor that has the ability to give somewhere between 0.5% and 3% of his goal, which is $1 million. So that's somebody that's somewhere between $5,000 and $30,000, right? That's their best gift. That's not their current gift, and it might not even be their gift in the next couple of years. But a person, generally somebody that has the ability to give 30,000 or more, they're either the CEO of a company or a business owner, right? Those are the attributes. The person who's the tier 2 is probably an employee that has, in his caseload, is probably an employee that receives significant bonuses on an annual basis, because that's a lot of money, right? That might be, when you think about somebody who's making $150,000 a year, they probably can't give $25,000, right? Unless they're super generous, right? So a tier 2, it's still an individual strategy, but it probably includes some Zoom calls and some phone calls, right? So we're taking donors seriously. What I mean is we want to take every donor seriously, but not treat every donor the same. And then our tier 3 donors are people on your list that have the ability to give less than, in his case, $5,000 a year. They're still awesome people, but our strategy with them might be a phone call is the most intimate, and then we might actually just be sending them updates. Like, for example, if there's an update that's meaningful, you might forward it to 10 people, right? And so we're having these different strategies for our bigger lists that are helpful for our time management, right? We have only so much time. And so I want to remind you that sometimes there's somebody down here that's giving a very modest gift, but they're the widow's mite, and you know they're giving sacrificially. And you probably shouldn't take them out to lunch 4 times a year and spend all the money on them, but I charge you to care for them relationally. When you stumble across a sacrificial giver, we need to treat them with high attention. So I was thinking about this gift officer that I've had the chance to take from. They had never raised any money, and they had a goal their first year of raising $150,000, and their goal now is well over $1 million annually. It's been about 5 years, right? And he's one of those people that has like religiously focused on tier ones. Like he figured out who the people were on his list that had the potential. They weren't giving to their potential, but he spent time with them in their world, and it's paid off incredibly well for the ministry, not for his own success, but for the outcomes of the organization. So strategy and how we approach our prospects is important. It's another way of saying is what is the smallest number of donors we can talk with to raise the largest amount of money? That's ultimately the question. It's not always the urgent question, right? Like I was working with a woman, she was the heir to the Dow Chemical fortune. She wouldn't return my phone calls, but I was so faithful in trying to pursue her. I was pretty sure she was ghosting me. I was pretty sure she wanted nothing to do with me. And then right here in Orlando, I bumped into her in Winter Park on Park Avenue. And she looks at me, I look at her, and I'm like, she hates me. She never writes me back. She never calls me back. And she looked at me and said, Brad, it's so good to see you. I got your emails. We're totally in, right? But I had spent my time focusing on the right people. Her response didn't feel very good, but I had consistently pursued a person who had all those traits, all these traits. They were givers, they had capacity, they were connected in a significant way, and they were a current donor. And so I was convinced that if I spent time with the right person, the right result would happen. And along the way, I didn't think the right result was going to happen, but praise God it did. And so lastly, this plan, we overcomplicate things. But a good plan for you as a person raising money, here's the plan if I had to give it to you. Ask once a year, thank 3 times a year. Like, ask once, thank 3 times. Put your plan to do that on a calendar. And here is a very simple. In the summer, we update the case. In August and September, we share the case and do asks. In October, we have a gala, and we do our final things. In April, May, we engage, update, and thank major donors. Like, it really doesn't have to be overcomplicated. But having a plan that allows us to ask once and thank 3 times. Some organizations think that you should be asking all the time. Some organizations do end-of-the-year appeals to all their donors, even to the donors that have given a lot of money. I think that's pretty sad, right? If a donor's already given you $50,000, why are you sending them an end-of-the-year appeal? Why not send them an end-of-the-year thank you, right? Do you really get that much money in the envelope that you insert in the newsletter? Is it such a successful strategy that you want to keep doing it? As soon as you insert that envelope, it becomes an ask, and it stops being a communication piece. And so a big part of our framework is that we have a calendar that we follow. So basically you have the message, it's carried by leadership. Who's it carried to? It's to prospects, and we do it in a strategic way, and then we have a plan. And so what I'd like you to